Hi everyone. So as Tina said, my name is Claire Bennett and I'm here on behalf of New Leaf Health to talk you through the landscape, I think, around mental health, specifically around our line managers and what kind of support we can offer the line managers for the line managers to offer your people. So let's have a look at what we're going to cover off in the session today. So we're going to really look at the overall landscape. So there's actually quite a lot of data out there. There's a lot of research that has happened over the years for us to really understand what is it that people are looking for, what is it that's really important to businesses, and what is a lot of that data trying to tell us. So we're going to have a look at some of that. We're also then going to try and understand the role of the line manager and how important that is to our businesses. But also then I think it's really important that we spend a little bit of time thinking about the challenges that the line managers are facing in today's workplace. And then, of course, what the most important thing is, how can you help? So what is it that various organisations can do so that line managers feel more comfortable in what's being asked of them within the realms and the context of their role as a line manager, and bring in mental health and well-being into that. So I think it's important that we start with that landscape. So let's have a look at some of the data that we've got out there. Now, all of this data, as you can see, is actually provided by Deloitte. So Deloitte do a survey about every 3 years. So the previous one to that was 2021, and last year they published their findings for 2024. And they look at a wide range of industries that are UK based, and they use that data to give us an idea of what that landscape looks like. So one of the things to note is, I think the cost to UK employers is slowly building. So for example, 2021's data, we were looking at about 45 billion every year. Okay, we are now looking at about 51 billion in terms of the cost of poor mental health in the workplace. So we know it is a significant issue for many, many businesses and organisations. But I actually think it's quite interesting when you break that down, because I think historically we have looked at sickness and absence as to where the cost is really coming from. And it's really interesting because that isn't where the bulk of the cost comes from. So of course, sickness and absence is a proportion of that 51. Of course, attrition will also be in there, where people are leaving organisations and that churn of staff and all the costs associated with that. But what's very interesting is that more than half, or less, just under half, sorry, of that 51 billion is all to do with presenteeism. So what we mean by presenteeism is people are coming into work, they're there, they're in the workplace, but actually they're potentially doing that whilst unwell. Or whilst experiencing symptoms of poor mental health. And as a result of that, we see a number of different things. So we will see a lack of productivity. Okay, so if a person isn't thriving mentally in a workplace, then it's going to affect their ability to conduct their job in the most productive way. Okay, so we will see an impact on productivity. But we can also see the negative mindset and the impact that that has on the outputs, because what we also then might see are uncharacteristic mistakes being made. They could be costly mistakes to organisations. So it's really important for us to understand that it's wider than just the sickness absence. We've seen a big shift actually in lots of organisations who are now really focusing on that presenteeism. What can I do to support my people that are in work? And of course, this is where the line manager role is vitally important, because the problem with presenteeism is that if we don't put something in place, if we don't try to help and support people in the workplace, then it becomes kind of contagious, right? Because if you're with someone who is in a negative mindset, right, on a regular basis, and they're not feeling great and they may verbalize that, it can actually be really draining on your energy. And so what you tend to find, if it is just left and not supported, it grows. And sometimes you can have entire teams, even departments, where presenteeism is rife and productivity drops and mistakes are being made. And you start to see how those kinds of things can impact, of course, the cost to the overall business. I think it's really important for us to also understand that some of the societal impacts and some of the things that happen from a external perspective, and diagnosis of mental health illness is one of those things. So 24% of workers are living with a diagnosed mental health illness. And that is slowly increasing. So we are seeing more people with a diagnosis in the workplace. And actually, what's really interesting is when you break that down into kind of the generations, because our Gen Zs, okay, so these are the ones that are coming into the workforce now. What we are seeing is that they are a particular generation that have a much higher level of diagnosed mental health illnesses. In fact, so much so that it has switched the most common mental health illness, which was about 4 years ago, was depression. In the UK, that was the most common mental health illness with a diagnosis. We are now seeing anxiety disorders taking over from that. And that's important for us to understand, especially from a generational perspective, because those are the individuals that are coming into the workforce now that are changing how our workforces are developing, because they are going to be the ones that are our future, our business's future. So we really have to understand where they're coming from. And I think you also need to understand why, okay? Because one of the things that I'm going to talk about in a little while is that differences in generations and the complexity that then brings into a workforce. Because some of the research suggests the reason that we see such a high percentage of diagnosed mental health illnesses in that particular generation is because they were the very first generation to go through puberty with social media. No other generation has had to navigate that arena at such an informative age. And so the negative impacts of that kind of environment, and especially it indicates why anxiety disorders are now more common, because that a lot of what brings out anxiety, it can be linked to those levels of social media, with the comparisons, with perceived public humiliation that can happen very regularly and very quickly, and the incessantness of it. You know, if I think back to when I was a teenager, I don't remember having as much information thrown at me. And, you know, home could be my safe space where I would be quiet and out of the way. And if I'd argued with a friend, you know, by the next day, it'd probably be forgotten about. That doesn't happen in this day and age. So our generations that are now entering the workforce have had a very different experience from their tender, informative years. So it's important for us to understand that. And workforces need to be robust enough to understand what that looks like when I have a higher proportion of my workforce that may well live with a mental health illness, which of course is legally protected. Okay. I think we also need to consider all of the other stuff that's going on in the world that affects all generations. Of course, we've got the cost of living. There's lots of things happening globally at the moment, which can, of course, put pressures on people, especially, you know, the financial situation that many people are finding themselves in currently. And as a result of that, and then as a result of the pressures that then are brought in from a workplace perspective, you know, when people in society are struggling financially, you find that businesses also have a lot of those issues as well. And so we might have to change the way we work. There might be other things that happen in the workplace that can put additional pressure on people. And what's interesting about the term burnout is that it has actually now been classified as a disease. So the ICD, which is the International Classification of Diseases, have now named this as a workplace syndrome. So the World Health Organization defined burnout as a syndrome that's resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. And there are 3 characteristics to burnout. So the first one is exhaustion, depletion of energy. The second one is a disconnect from the job. So the job satisfaction, might be very cynical about our job or our workplace. And then the next one is, of course, as a result of those things, you're going to see a drop in productivity and performance within the workplace. And in that report from Deloitte, 63% of people cited that they've had at least one of those characteristics in the last 12 months, which, of course, in turn is having an impact on your organizations, because any of those symptoms are going to affect the performance. Okay. I think it's also really important to understand where our people are coming from, because there is now a different level of expectation as to what the workplace does and provides for us. And 60% of workers would expect their line manager and senior leaders in an organisation to support their mental health and well-being at work. There's an expectation that that is now there. In fact, I was in a university yesterday and I was talking to some of the students. So they've just finished their degree. They was finishing a psychology degree. And when we talked about next steps, and where they were looking to work, and where did they want to start their careers, and we had all of those kinds of conversations, they were really talking about the types of organizations they want to work for. So if we want to attract new talent into organizations, actually a well thought through wellbeing strategy, initiatives that are in place to look after our workforce are now actually really important to our new generations coming in. So it is something that we have to be really aware of, is that level of expectation. We also then need to understand our performance versus that. So whilst more than half of our people actually expect us to do something about it, 44% have said, but we're not actually doing that well at it. So we know that there is room for improvement. I think we need to think broader when it comes to mental health and well-being, because it's not about having one or two initiatives in a workplace. It should be the way we do things. A good well-being strategy should be overarching in all working practices. So we have to think bigger than a Fruit Friday. Fruit Friday is not a well-being strategy. Whilst it's lovely for that to benefit to have for people, it is not where it stops. It needs to be much more strategic. And then you have to think about the return on investment. So lots of organisations that I talk to talk about the fact that initiatives are a cost. But actually, I think we need to start realising that they're more of an investment in our people, and understanding the impact that that has. So again, in the Deloitte paper, they looked at the return on investment, and where there are good structured mental health and wellbeing strategies and initiatives in place, we see a return of £4.70 in terms of the increase of productivity for every pound spent. But I think one of the key things for us to understand is that you can better that. And you can better that with awareness and education. Because when I'm aware of something, when it's brought to my attention, when I understand my own behaviour or how that might be impacting other people, or what I can do to try and help myself, and I'm educated to be able to combat those things, then actually we see far better outcomes. So the return on investment, when we have awareness initiatives and when we educate people around mental health and well-being, we see a much better return on investment, and the data would show £5 for every £1 spent. So when we look at that impact, what that report states is that employers should continue or start to build literacy for all employees and managers in particular, to understand their poor mental health, but also recognise the signs of others who are experiencing poor mental health. We also need to be able to upskill to know how to support them. How do we promote good mental health? How do we navigate how the person gets the right type of support for them? And so it's really important that we equip our managers to be able to do that. But it's not always as simple or as easy, I would say. And so, I work a lot with line managers. My background is in leadership training, and then I've coupled that with, my mental health expertise. And actually, a lot of the line managers that I talk to, and some data that is out there. So I've used the CIPD 2025 report for some of the data here, as well as the Workforce Institute survey that has given us some of this data. and also then anecdotally speaking to line managers that I train on a regular basis, there are some genuine concerns out there. So a lot of it is around lack of knowledge. Understanding mental health is not a given. Not everybody really gets it. There are so many myths that are out there in society around what mental health looks like. Sometimes it can be really trivialized. You know, the difference between poor mental health and mental illness is not always recognized. People are very quick to label certain emotions as a mental health illness and that ends up trivializing it. I'll give you a really good example: obsessive compulsive disorder. Society will have you believe that that is somebody who likes something clean or is super organized. And actually, that's just a personality preference. That's nothing to do with what OCD is. OCD is a debilitating condition that's very treatable. People can live very fruitful lives once they've experienced treatment and get the right type of support. But it is actually kind of a life-changing condition, but society has trivialized it. And we see a lot of that happening. And so actually, there's a huge lack of knowledge out there. And one of the bit of data that came out of the CIPD report for 2025 was that only 32% of UK employers actually offer any kind of training to their line managers around how to manage and support in a safe way mental health and well-being of their staff. And so we know there's a lot more work to do there, because we know the better return on investment is when we raise awareness and we educate. I also think it's about our line managers' skills and the style of line manager. Because actually in the Workforce Institute survey, what we saw is that 43% of workers who answered that survey had left a workplace because of their line manager. And I hear that anecdotally a lot. And I think many people, probably a lot of you here today, can think of where line managers have been great and how positive that's been. And we remember that line manager. But we also remember the line manager that maybe the style of line manager didn't really work for us. Maybe that line manager didn't really have the skills or interpersonal skills to be able to successfully manage a team. And so we can always remember that person too. But we have to understand the impact of either of those is significant. So when it's a good impact, then actually, one, you retain your staff, you have a much happier workforce, they're thriving, and your brand is protected. Because when those people leave an organisation because of a line manager, the name of your brand is associated with that person, and the negative comments are associated then with your brand. So actually, it's vital that we get this bit right. And I think sometimes we have people, succession planning, etc. in the workplace can be something that's really complicated, but quite often what happens is that you might have areas of expertise. A very simple example I can give you is maybe in an IT environment, somebody who's great at IT, they've got excellent knowledge, their skills is fantastic. We want to retain that person, so we make them a manager. But unless that manager is trained and supported and given all of the tools that they need to be a successful line manager, we actually see that it has such a negative impact on the people that they line manage, and also their own mental health can be massively impacted. So we need to understand that training and investing in our line managers is vital to all areas of our business. I also think, and this might be a societal one, as well, because many people still don't talk about their mental health. Many people avoid opening up a conversation about it because there is the fear of getting it wrong. What if I make the situation worse? I also get things from line managers like, it's none of my business. That's a workplace scenario. Or even, that's HR's job. That's not my job. You also get that kind of feedback. And there's a real genuine fear that they're going to do something wrong. Some people even have fears that they're going to break the law, or they're going to get themselves into trouble if they try to have these conversations. When actually what we know is, again, with awareness and training and understanding and being given safe ways of having those conversations, that those fears can actually be mitigated. Those risks can be mitigated. People can be supported in a workplace, and we see much, much better outcomes when we've had those skills developed within our teams. I think it's also, we have to think about the stigma that's existed for many years. Stigma has existed in the workplace, and it still is there. Whilst I do think it's got better to a degree, it is still present. There is a fear of consequence. If I tell somebody that I'm going through a tough time, I'm going to get overlooked for the next promotion, or I'm not going to get involved in a project, or opportunities will be put over my head, and I'll be seen as somebody who can't cope, and it's still in some cases seen as a weakness. But I think we also have to bring in the generational differences. So I talked to you a little bit earlier about our younger generation, and how actually their upbringings, the things they've been exposed to at young ages, is different to other generations. So we are actually seeing those different behaviours. And when I go into organisations and do training and speak to line managers, you can start to see the divide around those generations. So of course, many of our line managers are of a different generation of the people that they're managing, and sometimes that can cause conflict. So again, it's understanding that those things are there. Can we understand where our young people are coming from? Can our young people appreciate and understand where our older generations are coming from? And what their experiences are, and can we come together with a common ground to move forward? And again, this is where awareness and understanding of those things is really, really important. I also think it's about your culture. Is it okay to say, I'm having a tough time? Is it an open culture? Are those fear of consequences mitigated because actually we see our leaders being really open about our mental health? We see those initiatives, it's embraced. It's not just a tick box exercise in my organisation. This is how we do things. Do we have that kind of culture? Because when we have that kind of culture, our managers thrive. Okay, they're given permission to support each other and support their teams. Whereas if they don't see that from higher above, if they don't see that within their culture, it's actually very hard for a line manager to create that kind of subculture in their own team of openness if that is not widely adopted across the whole organisation. And then you have to get down to the technicalities. If you don't have policies, if you don't have working practices that support your line managers, you're kind of leaving them to kind of flail, because they don't know what they are supposed to do. They don't know what the guidance is. You need to be very clear with your line managers and give them the guidance on what you as an organisation want to stand for, and support them through that. And we can only do that with working practices and policies. So it's vitally important that we have them. Where they don't exist, it's a big challenge for our line managers. So what can we do to try and help? So what you can see here on the screen is actually parts of it are taken from the NICE guidelines. So NG 212 is its technical name, which was actually, it's the mental health workplace guidance from NICE. It was reviewed and then relaunched in March 2022. So we're currently working off that strategic plan, which covers lots of different areas within an organisation. So it's a really great place for you to go and have a look at, to just see what the guidance is saying, and is there anything that you can pull from that. But what I've pulled out here are things that are very specific to your line manager, and what we should be looking at in terms of developing their skills. So where we see a line manager that promotes a management style of encouraging participation, being able to delegate effectively within their teams, good constructive feedback, mentoring and coaching, an ability to deal with conflict within a team as well, and how to manage that and negotiate that. When we support our line managers to do that, we are creating a much healthier workforce. Knowing how to motivate people, and remember that one size does not fit all. Not every single person in a team is going to be motivated in the same way. And so actually a line manager's role is to really navigate that, understand their team, know who their team are, and know how to motivate motivate and support that person, but they need training to be able to do that. Do they understand what that's going to look like, so they can increase that performance and job satisfaction of their team and themselves, actually, because that's a big motivator for someone when they start to see the fruits of their labor. An increased understanding and self-awareness. So I do a lot of line manager training, but also in general mental health training. And one of the key things to positive mental health is self-awareness. And it's even more important for a line manager. When a line manager's having a bad day, it isn't usually just a bad day. It can mean that that's a bad day for that entire team, depending on how they navigate that and what behaviours they display as a result. So it's really important that they can understand and identify it and have an open discussion and conversation with their team, or know how to mitigate those kinds of risks. They need to understand that when their behaviours start to affect their team, it can be stress inducing. Okay, so that can obviously lead to that burnout if it's gone on for a long period of time. We also need to make sure that our line managers understand how to have conversation. Okay, and it's not just simple, oh, anybody have a conversation. How do I safely, protecting myself, protecting the business, and protecting the person in my team, how do I safely have a really sensitive conversation with somebody in the workplace? And again, frameworks to have that, they exist, and frameworks of how somebody can manage that in a conversation are absolutely key. We need to help our line managers there. It's not okay to expect them. We can't just expect them to know how to navigate that situation. Many of us struggle with that kind of conversation just in our social circles, never mind bringing in the complexities of the workplace and a line manager role into that. So we have to be able to manage that too. And then also knowing what to do with it. So another concern that I get from lots of line managers is, oh, I end up taking on, all of the problems of the people in my team, and especially those that are quite empathetic. They can sometimes absorb some of the emotions and the things that are going on for people in their team. But actually, if we're using safe frameworks to have conversations with people in the workplace, then part of that is having clear boundaries as to where the line manager can support and where that professional support might need to come in. And so being able to give those tools to our managers and be able to let them know where they can send people to, where does that signposting need to happen, how do we bring in other services that can support, because it shouldn't all be on the line manager's shoulders. It shouldn't be a big weight that they're carrying around with them. This is a partnership. All conversations around mental health should be partnership approach. It should be bringing in the right people at the right time to support somebody. And we can help line managers to do that by giving them the right guidance and the right education. So there are some considerations, okay, that I would ask you to think about before we get to the Q&A. Think about your well-being strategy. Is it part of your overall business strategy? Is it the way you do things? Now, I'm not saying that people shouldn't be known as well-being leads and there shouldn't be people that have well-being in their job titles. Absolutely, it's great to have that focus in an organisation. But actually, it should just be the part of how we do things. Every policy, mental health and wellbeing should be threaded through. Every working practice, every target, everything that you were trying to achieve in your overall business strategy, there should be questions about people's well-being and their mental health for us to be able to achieve that. How are we going to support people so that we can achieve that ultimate goal? So it should be threaded through every single thing that we do. We should be tackling stigma head on, and we should be leading by example. Our senior leaders in organisations should be the ones that are leading that way. There's a lot of misinformation out there, as I've already mentioned, about mental health. So education and awareness initiatives in workplaces are absolutely vital for us to make a sustainable change in behaviour. Addressing some of those common concerns that I've just gone through for line managers, providing them with guidance and training to be able to alleviate some of the concerns that they have, and to equip them to be able to deal with this in a safe way in the workplace. improve self-awareness of all people. So it is vital for a line manager to understand how they, how their behavior affects other people. But I would say self-awareness is a key life skill that is beneficial to everybody. Within a team environment, if you understand how your behavior is affecting all of your colleagues, you're going to have a much better team. It's really about understanding how that impacts other people. Safe framework to build confidence to having those mental health discussions is really important. Give people what they need to be able to do this with confidence. Practical tools. There's lots and lots of practical tools out there that can be involved in a lot of the different types of training for line managers, but also for our team members as well. How our team members can use their own self-help tools to be able to navigate maybe a tough time that they're having. And then also, really prioritizing well-being and safety, and having those working practices from root to tip, having all of those working practices aligned with your overall well-being strategy that should be embedded in all threads. So that is everything that I have for us to go through. So we've now got just under 15 minutes to go through any questions that anybody may have.
Okay, I'm looking to see if anybody's asked anything through the Q&A function and the chat function, and we don't appear to have anything, but not surprisingly, I do have quite a few questions. I thought that was really interesting. There was a lot of information there that, I wasn't even aware of, particularly about burnout now being classified as a disease. I'm not entirely convinced a lot of organizations are aware of that. That's not really anything that's come over my radar that's been particularly well publicized. And I think it's really critical because, as you rightly pointed out, there are so many risks that sit within an organization, particularly highlighted from the Deloitte report, that as an organization, if you're not aware that that is classified as a disease, the trouble that you could get into is huge. And, you highlighted there some of the challenges that managers have around the fear being real, about getting it wrong. I have to say, yes, it is. And so because of the fear, they do nothing, because the fear of getting it wrong isn't just about impacting that individual. It's also about impacting their own career.
Yep.
It's also about losing their job. Yeah, and it is about breaking the law and all of those aspects. Because I think employment law is a real minefield for people, and it changes daily. So I think one of the things I wanted to ask around that Deloitte report, did they make it gender specific at all? Because we know men have a stigma attached with not talking about their mental health. I know things are getting better, but we're not where we need to be. We're a long way off from where we need to be. But, I don't want to ignore the fact that things are improving and we are creating an up and coming generation where it is okay to talk about stuff. And even the kind of generation or the more maturing population are starting to open up. So I was just curious to know, did Deloitte actually make that gender specific or not?
So not all of the data. There are elements of the data which is gender specific, but not all bits of it were kind of broken down. What is interesting though, talking about generations, there is data in there now that talks about working parents. And actually, when you've got people who have maybe adolescent children, that actually the poor mental health that they're experiencing is actually as a consequence of the worries about their child and their child's mental health. So whilst the generations I was referring to, the your Gen Zs that are coming into the workforce now, you also have the impact of that is also on the working parents who are now worried about their children, which of course will start to affect their working practices.
And you've now got multi-generational households as well. So you've got the kind of what I would call the sandwich generation, those looking after their parents who are living in the house as well as their children. So they've got that kind of pressure. There's a lot coming on those individuals. Interestingly, I wasn't surprised when you talked around the kind of anxiety levels going up significantly, changing over the last 4 years from depression to anxiety. And obviously a lot of that has got to be doing with that information overload, not
Yeah.
really knowing what's fake, what's real. And I can only see that getting worse as AI continues to develop.
Yeah,
I thought
absolutely.
that was, yeah, I thought that was really interesting. Another question I had was, you talked about NICE putting out some new kind of mental health guidelines around. We
2022. It was
Yeah,
2022. Yeah.
2022. Yeah. And
Yeah.
so that was my question.
Mm.
Are they, are we expecting them to reproduce those at all? Because 3 years is quite a long time in the
Mhm.
mental health community. A casing point there would be neurodiverse individuals at work. A
Yeah.
lot of what we talked about today is supporting neurotypical individuals. But
Mm.
what help is there out there for managers managing a neurodiverse person who is hugely valuable to the workforce,
Absolutely.
massively valuable, because these guys really do, in my view, in my personal experience of friends, is they really do have what I would call a superpower, because they can do stuff that I just can't do. I would
Yeah.
only love to be able to do. But those individuals will need some level of understanding and some further support. So does the guidelines embrace that at all, do you think?
Doesn't. Interestingly, it doesn't. And actually, prior to the 2022 review, I think it had been like 6 or 7 years since the last time it had been revamped and reviewed. So we are working with the 2022 at the moment. There are still some really relevant things in there. And what's good
Yeah.
about the standards that they've, or some of the guidance that they've given, is that it breaks it down into different sizes of businesses, so even to the point of micro businesses and what they
Okay.
can do. So it's got lots of guidance in there, so it is still beneficial. But you're absolutely right to bring in the neurodiverse perspective. Again, that's a lot. I've done a lot of training, and it's including a lot of the mental health training that we do for line managers, because if you look at some of the statistics, between 70 and 80% of adults who have a neurodiverse condition also live with a mental health illness, because
Yes.
it's a risk factor. And what I think is really interesting about neurodiverse conditions and neurodiversity as a whole is that actually every single one of us is neurodifferent. Right? We
Absolutely.
are. None of us think exactly the same way.
Yeah.
And is that not what is amazing about the
Yeah.
world?
Yeah,
So
no,
yeah, it's just
absolutely. And that
about,
terminology, neurotypical, I don't necessarily like that. That is the recognized
yes, it
terminology,
is.
but I
Yeah.
don't think anybody's neurotypical, frankly.
I mean, society has broad neurotypical boundaries that we all live in, I
Yeah.
suppose. And then, of course, you've got those with a neurodiverse condition that don't conform to those boundaries. But you're right. Again, that's really hard for a line manager, right? A line manager to have to navigate that and understand those differences. It can be really challenging and scary, because someone with a neurodiverse condition, of course, could be legally protected under the Equality Act, and therefore it adds a layer of, oh, I'm just not going to go there or do anything because I might get it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you talked earlier on around kind of frameworks, developing frameworks, and that there are frameworks out there.
Mhm.
Are you as an organization able to share frameworks if anybody comes to you, wants some help and support? Are you there to be able to support people putting frameworks in place into their own organization to create a safer place for their managers to be able to give the support to their employees?
So when I talk about frameworks, I'm talking about a framework to have a conversation. So, and
Okay.
that is part of the training that we offer at New Leaf. So our line
Okay.
manager training has a framework that
Brilliant.
it's not a process, right? Because human beings are not step-by-step processes. It is a framework that
Yeah.
helps. I call it the safety net. It's the thing that bolsters your line managers when they're having a conversation, that helps them to go, I'm okay. I'm being held up by this, and when there's something that
Yeah.
happens that I don't know what to do, I know where I can go to get that support, and that
Yeah.
might well be HR or health or something like that. So
Yeah.
yeah,
It
it's
just help
part
them
of
to
our training.
navigate. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
navigating
yeah,
those conversations, and no
yeah,
one size fits all, as you rightly say, and no two conversations will ever be the same. But having a framework to work within does give in previous management positions that I've had, it's made me feel a lot safer. That actually, I
mhm.
think I have a structure of the kind of conversation I think I'm going to have. I think I've got some responses, but you know, where do I go with those? And it just gives me some safety there. We've got somebody who's come up with a question here. Said they're designing a manager training session, and they said they've included emotional intelligence. Do you suggest that they add some mental health support to this, or is this a separate subject?
So I think mental health is, so emotional intelligence is excellent, by the way. Can I say kudos for that? Because that really helps with the self-awareness piece, but it does need to be complemented then by understanding, well, what is mental health? Because some of that emotional intelligence might bring out some biases that you might have and preferences that you might have that might affect how you react to somebody with a specific mental health illness, for example, or someone who's experiencing poor mental health, and how to navigate that, or someone comes to you with work-related stress or stress at home. How do I navigate that? So whilst the emotional intelligence is brilliant, I can pick up on it, I can tell when somebody's, not quite themselves. It's what you then do. So I do think having then a complement of mental health training, which is specific on understanding it, identifying it, and then supporting it. And I think that's the important bit.
Okay, that's great. Well, I think that concludes our webinar for today. That's all the questions answered, and thank you very much for answering my questions. I really enjoyed that, thoroughly enjoyed that. Thank you everybody for joining us today.